Well, Donald Trump returned to the White House with a very specific political promise. America first, inflation under control, and no endless foreign wars. But now, that promise is colliding with a very different reality. Well, Trump ordered strikes on Iran, triggering a conflict that he initially suggested could be wrapped up within certain weeks. Instead, Iran has remained resilient, the Strait of Hormuz has disrupted a major share of global oil trade, gasoline prices have risen sharply, and most importantly for Trump, politically, Americans are increasingly afraid that the conflict could drag on. And now comes the warning sign that could haunt the Republican Party all the way to the November midterm polls. Well, we are talking about a new Reuters polls that has put Trump's approval rating at its lowest point of his current presidency, and even more damaging stat is that a huge majority of Americans believe the Iran conflict will continue for an extended period. So is Iran war becoming Trump's political liability? And could the very conflict Trump entered claiming was necessary to protect America end up threatening Republican control of Congress? Well, watch this edition of From the News Desk till the very end, because this story is not just about numbers, but about something far bigger than just another bad poll for Trump, and more interestingly, they could offer an early glimpse of what the 2026 midterms may look like. First, let's talk about the news. According to latest Reuters poll, only 33% of Americans approve of Trump's performance as president, while a whopping 64% disapprove. Well, that is down from 35% earlier this month and represents the lowest approval rating of his current presidency. In fact, it matches the lowest point of his previous presidency recorded in December 2017. But the timing of this poll is particularly worrying. Trump entered the White House in 2025 with just under half of Americans approving of his presidency. But his popularity has taken a hit during 2026, with the Iran conflict emerging as one of the major pressure points. Well, obviously, the war has disrupted roughly a fifth of global oil trade and contributed to higher gasoline prices for American households, and that creates a politically dangerous combination for Donald Trump. He did not campaign for a presidency defined by another prolonged Middle East conflict. He campaigned on avoiding exactly that kind of scenario. And when now voters are being asked to judge his presidency while watching gasoline prices rise and hearing repeated warnings that the Iran conflict may not be ending anytime soon, well, this gap between what Trump promised and what voters are experiencing could actually become very critical. Perhaps the most alarming finding is not Trump's 33% approval rating. It is what Americans think will happen next. Well, 80% of respondents said US involvement in Iran is likely to continue for an extended period. Well, that includes 87% of Democrats and crucially 71% of Republicans, and only 16% believe that the conflict may end in few weeks. Well, that is a major political warning. Well, Trump had initially indicated that the conflict would last only a few weeks, but Iran has continued resisting while the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily disturbed. But not only these 2 points, only about 1 in 5 Americans believes the war has been worth it, while only around half of Republicans hold that very view. Well, that means this is not simply a democratic attack on Trump's foreign policy, but there is a dissatisfaction inside Trump's own MAGA base. And for Republicans heading into competitive congressional races, that could be extremely dangerous. Well, candidates may be forced to defend a president whose approval rating is falling while simultaneously explaining higher fuel cost and overall conflict that voters increasingly fear could become prolonged. Now, this is where Trump's 2 campaign promises, economic security and avoiding prolonged wars, begin to collide. Inflation and the cost of living was central to Trump's political comeback. In fact, his campaign repeatedly focused on the everyday financial pressures faced by Americans, from groceries to gasoline. And this conflict has disrupted oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical global energy choke point. In fact, this poll also says the resulting disruption has contributed to a surge in gasoline prices that is weighing on US households. And voters tend to experience foreign policy differently when it reaches the gas pump. Well, it's obvious that a geopolitical crisis thousands of miles away can seem distant, but a higher gasoline bill is immediate and felt on the pocket. Reuters also found that Democrats have now moved ahead of Republicans on the question of which party would better handle the economy, 38% to 35%. Democrats are also viewed as better equipped to handle the cost of living. That is particularly significant because economic management has traditionally been one of the most important factors in congressional elections. Now, more interestingly, a separate Washington Post poll found that 54% of registered voters identified the economy and higher prices as major factors in their 2026 midterm vote. So Trump's political problem is potentially bigger than the war with Iran itself. If voters begin connecting the war and the high energy cost, the conflict could reinforce an existing concern about affordability. And that is a worrying sign for Donald Trump. Now, the 2026 midterm elections are not simply another set of congressional contests. They could determine how much power Trump has during the final year of his presidency. Congressional elections take place every 2 years, meaning the midterm provides voters with an opportunity to reshape the balance of power in Washington before the next presidential elections. Now, Republicans currently hold narrow majority in Congress. That makes House and Senate race particularly important. If Democrats take control of the House, Trump's ability to advance his legislative agenda could be sharply constrained. In fact, control of Senate is equally important because it affects confirmations, legislations, and the broader balance of power between the White House and the Congress. Now, at this juncture, multiple reports also suggest that Republicans are particularly concerned about defending their House majority, while Democrats increasingly see an opportunity in the Senate as well. And history adds another layer to this danger. Midterm elections frequently become a referendum of sorts on the president and the party controlling the White House. Well, that is why midterms are often decided by which party can energize and turn out its base rather than simply by winning over undecided voters. Well, that makes Trump's falling approval especially concerning for Republicans. Now remember, if Republicans become less enthusiastic while Democrats become more energized by opposing to Trump, even relatively small shifts in turnout could produce major changes in Congress. Well, there is still plenty of time before America votes. The Iran conflict could end, gasoline prices could fall, the economy could improve, Trump could secure a diplomatic breakthrough and transform the political narrative. But for now, at this juncture, the trajectory is uncomfortable for the president. His approval rating has fallen to 33%, 64% disapprove, 80% fear US involvement in Iran will continue for an extended period, and only around 1 in 5 Americans believe the war has been worth the cost. And at the same time, Democrats have gained ground on the economy while the cost of living remains one of the most important concerns for voters heading into November. Well, this is precisely why the next few months could be crucial and interesting at the same time for the American politics. Trump's political challenge is no longer simply convincing Americans that the Iran strikes were justified. He must convince them that the war will not become another long-lasting American conflict and that its economic consequences will not undermine the very affordability agenda that helped bring him back to the White House. Because when Americans walk into polling booths in November, they will not just be voting on Iran. They will be voting on prices, gasoline, the economy, Trump's leadership, and whether they want his party to continue controlling the Congress. And that is what makes this latest poll such a serious warning for Donald Trump. The president promised Americans that his second term would be about peace, prosperity, and putting America first. But now, as the midterm approaches, voters are being asked to judge a presidency increasingly defined by an unresolved war, economic pressure, and most importantly, fears that the conflict could last much longer than promised. Now, for Trump and the Republican Party, the question is no longer simply whether they can win the midterms. The bigger question is whether the Iran war will become the issue that turns the 2026 midterm into a referendum on Trump's second presidency. Well, with that, it's a wrap on today's edition of From the News Desk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm Yash Goyal signing off for Times Now Digital. Until next time, take care and keep watching this space for more such videos.